welcome to this review of my IBM M122, specifically the small variant, as I've already covered the large variant. Yes, I just called this humongous piece of kit small. The M122 is a 122 key version of the IBM Model M intended for terminal computers. It was the replacement of the earlier Model F122 keyboard, commonly known as the IBM Battleship. This was in time replaced by the cheaper first version of the M122, which looked almost exactly the same but was very different under the bonnet, and later by the slightly smaller, more streamlined version that we're looking at today. Being smaller than a battleship, this is a kind of battlecruiser model, although it's frequently named to be a battleship too because it uses the battleship layout and it doesn't have any of the extra features many battlecruiser keyboards had. These were generally upgraded full-size keyboards rather than special-purpose terminal boards. Ironically, this leads some battlecruiser keyboards to have more keys than battleships do. Anyway, I just refer to them as the Battleship and the Battlecruiser M122 to distinguish them. It's easier that way, I reckon. The Battleship M122 is the square badge era version of this keyboard, while the Battlecruiser ones use the later grey and blue plastic oval badges. I'll be honest, although the Battleship model is more imposing, I prefer the styling on the Battlecruiser model. It looks a bit more modern and refined. In going from the earlier to this later version, they changed a whole bunch of parts, but they didn't change them overnight. The parts were changed one by one, and as such there were many different versions of this one on the market. The most obvious, and I guess one of the first things they changed, is the case, which was originally thick but rigid plastic on the F122, but they later changed this to a more flexible case like on the normal Model M. The case is a little bit thinner, but because of its flexibility, it's actually less prone to shattering. Another thing they changed over time is the cable. The very first ones used the same massive 5-pin terminal DIN plugs with metal connectors on the end as the F122, but these were later changed for plastic DIN plugs and eventually for a terminal jack. For most battleship models it's the DIN plug, and for the majority of battlecruisers it's the terminal jack. All three versions, including the F122 that came before it, use the same protocol called SET3. You can convert this to USB using a special converter. The ones I use were made by Ari Halcon, who does versions for both the DIN and terminal jack models. He also does similar looking converters for ATXT and for PS2 keyboards, by the way. I asked if he could toss one of these in for free on a large order I placed in exchange for some exposure on this video, and I have no trouble recommending his stuff because I've been using his converters for over 2 years, and although they're expensive, they're by far the best on the market. Between all these different keyboards I use, these things have never let me down. They're very well made and they're really size efficient too. I mean, I don't know how the actual hell he managed to cram a whole chipset in here, but however he did it, it's 2 thumbs up. See the link in the description for a link on where to get his converters. I highly recommend them. This thing is much the same as a Model M, using the typical buckling spring key switches, which are very nice to use if a tad noisy. It's thick and has a metal backplate and the whole lot, so it's built like the proverbial stone toilet. Naturally, it is noticeably bigger than a normal 101 key Model M, but it's actually the same weight as a 101 key from that era would have been, at 2.0 kilos. Of course, this model is the lightest version of the 3 main 122 key terminal keyboards IBM made. The Battleship version is considerably heavier at 2.8 kilos, and the Model F sits in a giant pan that skyrockets the weight to a full 4 kilos, probably making it the heaviest mainstream vintage keyboard out there, I reckon. Unicom still do a version of this keyboard actually, and it's based on this Battlecruiser version, except it's USB and theirs usually come with lock lights, whereas the vintage ones usually didn't. I found this particular one at the recycling center together with the other M122, both of which cost 50p, and they were both in pretty decent condition. I didn't even bother to clean this one because there's almost no dirt on it. Definitely a nice find because I'd been quite interested in these models for a while. The thing is, these feel like perfect zombie apocalypse defense attributes because of their length and large surface area, but at the same time nice flat striking profile and good but not over the top weight. I reckon the F122 is much tougher and would definitely withstand the impact better, but would take too long to swing. This one feels like it would hit harder, all things considered. The different case and chassis do impart a different sound to the key switch action though, compared to the larger M122. Here's what they sound like when compared to each other. The battlecruiser is actually considerably bassier. One thing that of course deserves special mention is the layout, which is the same as that of the other 122 key models, albeit with slightly different legends, but really they're basically identical. Something noteworthy that characterizes these terminal models is that they all use an ISO-like layout, with a short left shift and a vertical enter key. Other features include 2 rows of F keys rather than 1, which are sometimes labeled as command keys instead, an extra bunch of buttons on the left with all sorts of commands, and a different nav cluster and numpad. Using a Saurus converter like Orialcon's comes with a standard layout for the keyboard, but you can reprogram it if you want to. Because the F keys are in a weird position, there's no escape key, so instead it's stuck on the numpad like it is on the AT layout, and there's only one large vertical key present on the numpad as well, which is set to num plus by default. I do miss the numpad enter key though. The other thing is the nav, which is in a cross shape instead of the more familiar inverse T that other keyboards use. The idea behind this, I guess, is that it more closely mirrors the layout of the arrow keys that are present on the numpad, although the keycaps on terminal boards don't often include those, and I'm not sure they actually have that functionality. I myself found that cross navs are much less comfortable and easy to use than a trusty old T-nav, and in fact I think this is one of the board's biggest weaknesses. The keycaps are IBM standard ones, which are among the best ever made. They're very thick PBT with high quality die sublimed legends. These ones are of the 2-part variety, of which you can just take the top off and interchange them, and in fact I think these 2-part caps were first introduced with terminal 122 key keyboards. This one was made in the UK plant in Greenock, Scotland, and in the period where they wanted to make equipment less static, so they made the spacebar out of ABS instead of PBT, and they included a grounding wire to it. You can easily recognize those because, like this one, those spacebars tend to yellow over time. They did this because people were still using CRT monitors at the time, which is basically an electron cannon firing at the inside of a screen facing the operator, so to avoid the equipment from gradually charging up its user, they used things like this. The US plant didn't do stuff like this, they kept normal PBT spacebars instead. Of course, being terminal keyboards, they have a weird layout, and some of the legends read really weird stuff with functions that boggle the average human mind, such as imp, help hex, reset quit, I don't know what that's about, field exit, which is not an enter key because there's an enter key here, and it's not a return key because that's there. There's also a whole bunch of blank keys, especially on the left side and on the numpad. Basically, that means that for that particular terminal, those keys didn't do anything. The amount and position of blank keys varies per model. Basically though, it's a Model M, with all the advantages of being so, but with a greater awesome factor at the expense of some of its usability. The layout is not quite as good, and while its size lends it a certain je ne sais quoi, it does take up a considerable amount of your desk. Still, it's a classic and more than worth considering. I mean, let's be honest, nobody buys a Model M just for the typing feel and sound. You also buy it at least partially because it's fucking awesome to begin with. That's it for this review. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. And following is a typing demonstration of me typing on this keyboard.